Hello everyone, and welcome to this video on understanding culture. What we're going to do is look at two major questions. So what national culture specifically, to distinguish it from organizational culture, actually is. So what is national culture, or culture linked to groups of people, as well as taking a brief look at how useful culture actually is as a guide to behavior. And this would include both institutional behavior as well as individual behavior. And we are going to look at some common tropes that are often used when people think that culture perhaps is an exact guide to behavior, when in fact it is a lot more complex than that. So if we go on and look at the first question of what is culture exactly, in particular national culture, and the answer, as it is with a lot of topics like this, is quite complex. So culture is used in a lot of different ways. People can talk about someone being cultured. Some people can talk about arts and culture, as well as many other different forms of culture. So we have some overlapping definitions. I guess the most basic definition can be that culture is a set of influences exerted by and from the social environment over learned behavior. So if we consider our own individual behaviors, quite a few of those are going to be either directly or indirectly influenced by the culture that we exist within. So that would be by the external social environment. That is very individual. So I think it's difficult to say, or would be wrong to say, that culture really is a function of the country you live in only. It can have overlapping cultures and subcultures by different regions, by different interest groups, by different religious and ethnic communities. So it is quite a complex set of social environments, but we can look at the influence that exerts, and we can examine our own learned rather than innate behavior, and we can really call that culture, that external social environmental influence. As well as this, we can look at not just the individual, but we can look at groups of people, and we can say that the way of life of a particular group of people is their culture. So that can be behavior, attitudes, moral and religious beliefs, habits, acts, rituals. All of these things can come under culture. So if you take a single group of people, and let's say those group of people have some commonalities in terms of religion and an outlook, and we can really identify the culture that exists between them. So as well as the individual being influenced by their environment, we can also look at the group, and we can see the beginnings of group culture. As well as this, a third way that we probably want to understand culture is the embedded beliefs and values and rules that really exist within institutions. So as well as culture that's exerted through horizontal culture, through communities and peer groups, family networks, kinship networks, we also have to understand that institutions, whether those are governing institutions, economic institutions, social institutions, these are really embedded within culture as well, and they play an important role in replicating culture and impacting culture. So we have to understand culture as not just an informal phenomenon that exists within the community, but also exists within institutions that impact individuals and groups. Now, it's worth pointing out that all of these overlapping definitions don't just apply to nations or countries. So you can very much identify, let's say, for example, a New Zealand culture, but also these definitions would also apply to help us identify a Maori culture, or a culture in Auckland, or any other number of subcultures or smaller group cultures within New Zealand. So it would be a mistake to think that there is simply one single national culture. There very much isn't. Some cultures would spread across national borders. So we can think of the Kurds. So despite large parts of the Kurdish population being divided by borders, you've got Kurds in Iraq, you have Kurds in Syria, we have Kurds in Turkey, but we can also identify a Kurdish culture. shared language, attitudes, values that really are unique to the Kurdish populations, but they do interact with national culture. So you would imagine that Kurds growing up in Turkey would have been influenced by Turkish national culture as well as Kurdish culture. Same would go for Kurds growing up in Syria. They'd have the influence of Syrian national culture as well as their own Kurdish culture. So we need to stop thinking about culture as just this kind of monolithic thing which exists and is unchanging or eternal or ancient, but rather something which is fluid and constantly evolving and which interacts with lots of other phenomena as well. So it's dynamic rather than fixed. And while for us it's very useful to talk about national cultures, and it certainly helps when you're dealing with things like international businesses entering new markets, it is just a convenience rather than a sign that national culture is the most important type of culture. So if we move on and take a look at this concept in more detail, we want to examine how culture is expressed. So we have our different overlapping definitions of culture, but we also have three different ways that culture is expressed, or we can identify the expressions of culture. So we have high culture, folk culture, and deep culture. And the way we're going to organize this in our heads is by using the analogy of an iceberg. So with an iceberg, you have a good portion of the iceberg being above water. It's visible, if you're sailing or if you're on the sea, you can see the iceberg quite plainly above the water, but the majority of an iceberg is actually under the water. So it obviously is the iceberg. It has a big impact on how the iceberg moves and interacts with the ocean, but is not immediately visible. So like this, we're dividing culture into high and folk culture, which is fairly easily visible. You can see the differences in culture when we're looking at high and folk culture, but deep culture is often out of awareness. It's not immediately visible. It's there, it has an impact, it can be identified and discussed, but it requires an actual examination of these concepts. Within deep culture, it's not immediately obvious. So if we take our first of the three, which is high culture, these are the things that the particular group, so in this case we are focusing on national culture, so the nation as a whole takes as the best examples, the highest examples of some unique expression, often artistic expression. So whether it's fine arts, literature, traditional classical music and drama, these are all expressions of high culture. So if we think about the UK as an example of this, we can take things like Shakespeare's plays, classical English music, literature throughout English history as high culture. So Shakespeare, Chaucer are all examples of English high culture. They're not necessarily the most popular types of culture, so they're not the artistic expressions which are common, but they are artistic expressions which are seen as an emblem or really iconic amongst that group of people and their shared history and shared affiliation. We also have quite a lot of artistic expression in folk culture, but this would be ones which are very much embedded into the life of ordinary people within that group. So instead of just classical music, this would just be popular music, so folk music, which is common amongst all levels of society, particularly those of ordinary people, as well as things which are usually evident in the lived experience and the lives of ordinary people within the group. So courtship practice very much is part of folk culture. So how do people go about finding a partner and getting married? We can just look at how people live from different cultures, and we can immediately see differences in courtship practice. Cooking would be a major one. What kinds of foods do people eat? What are the major types of dishes? What are the general practices when it comes to preparing food? All of this is relatively on the surface. We can take, let's say, someone from or a group from India and a group from South Africa, and we can immediately see that they are fairly significant differences in cooking. As well as this, things like humor, dress, folk dancing, again, things which are relatively on the surface and visible. So remember that both high culture and folk culture within the iceberg concept are above the surface. So if you were to just visually see someone from, let's say, Laos, and visually see someone from Peru, you would immediately notice that there will be difference in how they're dressed. So we can see again a dress being above the surface and fairly obvious, but also we're distinguishing from high culture with folk culture. It would be immediately obvious in the lives and the everyday routine of ordinary people within that particular group. By contrast, deep culture is underneath the surface. So if we're using again the iceberg concept, it would be underneath the waterline. So it's very much part of culture. It's a significant, important part of culture, but it isn't necessarily immediately obvious. And this is because it's primarily not expressed through immediate and obviously identifiable activities such as dress and cooking and diet, but rather through attitudes and values. So instead of just taking a look at someone from Laos and taking a look at someone from Peru and saying, well, these are the cultural differences, you'd actually have to have a conversation with those people, get to know them, get to know their thinking, get to know their values, get to know their moral outlook and attitudes, and then you'd be able to identify significant cultural differences in deep culture. It's not on the surface, it's below the surface. So things here: behavior in public places, decision-making practices, the kind of priorities and prioritization of major decision-making and problem-solving, conceptions of friendship, ideas about leadership, gender roles would be a major one. These are all things that require conversations. They require getting to know somebody, and then we can identify what their gender roles are. Then we can identify and discuss what their ideas about leadership and their ideas about friendship are, as well as some other things. Non-verbal communication tends to be one that's not obviously present when you're just interacting with someone in a virtual manner. You have to actually physically be in the same space and have an interaction with them, and then we can see that non-verbal communication can be significantly impacted by cultural influence as well. You have some countries and some national cultures where non-verbal communication takes place mainly through facial cues, and there tends to be a significant distance between the participants in a conversation. And then we have other national cultures where non-verbal communication, as well as taking place through facial cues, would also take place through touch, through physical proximity. So again, we would get arrangement of physical space and how people interact with physical space as a key part of deep culture. Conversational patterns, religious principles and religious understandings, and eye behavior, tempo of work. So all of these things you can examine and look at how groups of people tend to approach them, how groups of people tend to cluster around certain patterns of behavior or certain attitudes, and that's our way of really identifying what the deep cultural influence actually is. I would warn you into thinking that all of these things are determined by national culture or culture. That really is not the case, but they are heavily influenced by national culture. So if we take, for example, gender roles, let's say someone growing up in a particular country within a particular culture is likely to be influenced and impacted by that culture's perception of gender roles and various social norms that exist within the culture. But this isn't to say that they're simply being programmed by the culture to think that genders operate in a certain way. You're going to get a huge amount of variance in thinking. People are also influenced by their own experiences. They're influenced by, how they've interacted with other cultures. They're influenced by their locality, their family's attitudes, their friendship attitudes. They're influenced by the things they read, the media they consume. And they're also influenced by their own thinking. You can have someone who's born into a culture that has very specific and set gender roles, and that person can very much question and challenge those gender roles and have a different understanding of them without needing to have been influenced by any outside culture. So we shouldn't think about culture as a set of programming that people are programmed to have uniform attitudes towards all of these deep cultural issues, and there's no real ability for them to think outside of these issues unless they're influenced by someone outside of that culture. That isn't the case. We're talking about culture having a significant and major influence on people's understanding of gender roles, on their conception of self, on their family relationships, on the way they work, the way they interact with physical space, but it's not a determining factor. It's an influential factor, but it's not the only factor, and neither is it necessarily the most important factor for every single individual. So the reality is always going to be more complex. Then I'm from this culture, and my culture says this is how we have family relationships, and therefore this is the way that I view family relationships. That's far too simplistic and reductive. But hopefully that's given you a sense of the range of ways that cultural influence is expressed, both in our collective endeavors, so both in high culture, our everyday lives within communities, so folk culture, as well as our fundamental attitudes, beliefs and values, which is deep culture. Now, we've already briefly touched upon this, but we are going to look at it in more detail. So this is the second of our two questions, which is how useful is culture as a guide to behaviour. This is really quite important, not just for international businesses and commerce, but also for our own understanding of the world, particularly as we're facing social and political trends which are quite worrisome and worrying about how we see people that have cultural influences that we see as foreign or alien. So the first thing that we have to do if we want to understand how culture influences or guides behavior is distinguish between individual expressions of culture, which is every individual person's internalized norms, beliefs, attitudes, values, and behaviors, and institutional expressions of culture. So that's group or national cultures embedded within institutions, whether those institutions are governing institutions, economic institutions, educational or business institutions. We do have a distinct difference there. So institutional expressions of culture are very, very important whenever you're trying to interact with another society or another country. So if, for example, you're an international business and you're looking to enter a new market, you really have to be keenly aware of how institutional expressions of culture through institutional mechanisms will impact your entry and operation within that country. So how the local legal system functions is influenced by culture, how governing institutions approach and conceive of certain issues, how economic regulation not just works on paper, but how it's understood within that society. All of these things are heavily influenced by culture, and that's something which is a really important guide for anyone that's operating within that country from another culture. So that's something which you can't understate the importance of being aware of how institutions are influenced by culture and how institutions operate not in a vacuum but within a particular cultural and social context. However, individual expressions of culture are very, very different. And what we often do is we downplay the variation and diversity within populations and within groups, instead just to say, well, it's just the culture. And we use culture as a determinant of that person's attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, instead of actually understanding that culture is one influence amongst many different influences, which is the first thing. And the second thing, understanding that culture is not a programming guide. It's something which is alive. It's something which is ever dynamic, ever changing, always being adapted and moved and evolving. So when we talk about the ancient culture of this country, this is really an Orientalist trope. It sees people belonging to certain cultures as being ancient, backwards, non-changing, very easy to understand if you grasp these couple of major cultural significant points. This is not how people work. This is not how people live. There is no such thing as an ancient culture, because culture is forever alive and moving and changing. So if you go to a country, so let's take a country such as China, which is often the subject of many Orientalist tropes about the ancient culture of Chinese people. This is an ancient old culture with these kind of very strong cultural influences upon its people. The culture in existence in China today is not the culture that was in existence in China, let's say, even 300 years ago, never mind 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. The culture in China today is a modern culture because it exists within a modern context. There's just as modern as the culture in, say, Spain or the Netherlands or Sweden. Culture is a modern phenomena. So therefore, individuals existing within a particular cultural context are part of the modern expression of that culture. They're influenced by current trends. They play a part in changing, evolving, and moving that culture forward as well. So it's really important that we reject these Orientalist tropes and these Orientalist ways of thinking, which see culture as somehow fixed, unchanged, and non-dynamic. Now, what we are going to do when we're looking at individual expressions of culture is there's a particular article which is relatively recent, so published in August of 2020 in the Santa Maria Times, so a relatively small local paper. And I feel bad for picking on this person, Dr. Linda Gant, who's a licensed marriage and family therapist. But I think that this article really does throw up some major red flags and is a really good example of how we shouldn't understand culture, how we shouldn't understand the cultural impact on behavior. Now, we're not going to go through the entire article, but if we pull up just a couple of key paragraphs, and this is from the very first paragraph, and although it doesn't start horribly, it quickly does go downhill. So the very first sentence in this article is culture is a belief about ethics, behaviors, and values that are held by a majority of people within a society. Well, that's broadly true, although we could quibble with the idea that culture is a single belief. It's lots of complex overlapping beliefs and influences, and there can be a lot of variation. But yeah, we'll accept the opening sentence, but it does quickly then go downhill. So the issue that I have with this opening paragraph is the example given here. So we've gone from saying the type of culture affects and influences what a person believes and how they behave, to giving the example that someone growing up in a collectivist culture where rules are strongly enforced does not support individualistic thoughts or behavior. This is a really absurd statement, and this is something that we need to absolutely avoid. What's happening here is Dr. Linda Gant is making a faulty transmission from one statement to an absurd conclusion. So if we go from the statement that a collectivist culture influences how people within that culture think and behave, which is reasonable, to going to say that someone growing up within that culture doesn't support individualistic thoughts or behavior is absurd. People within collectivist cultures are influenced by a collectivist mindset, but they are not the subjects of mind control. So if you grow up in a traditional culture, you are not actually being mind controlled into not supporting individualistic thoughts or behavior. Part of this is can really be drawn, and it's worth saying that Santa Maria and Dr. Linda is very likely American. That this is part of a Western trope and a Western attitude, that societies which are collectivist are somehow not capable of individual reasoning or thinking, and instead form part of a faceless mass of people that will all behave in the same way. This can be traced back through history. So the view of Arabs during the Crusades as being a faceless mass that will behave in the exact same way, through to the Yellow Peril and other racist tropes in the 20th century about Eastern Asian cultures all behaving in the same way and being, again, a faceless mass. And it's something that we really need to avoid. So having an individualistic or a collectivist culture will influence how you understand issues, but your understanding is individualistic. Your understanding is literally going to be your understanding. It is influenced by your external environment, but this kind of blunt statement that someone in that culture doesn't support thing A or doesn't understand thing B is highly questionable, and we have to understand within the context of history is closely associated with very racist and orientalist tropes and attitudes. So this is very much something we are going to avoid. As well as this, Dr. Linda's attitude towards religion and how culture and religious beliefs interact is very, very questionable as well. So what she says in this paragraph here is that some countries are predominantly one religion or another. That's absolutely true. That's just factual. Each religion carries its own sets of personal conduct. You see, here we start breaking down our chain of logic. Each religion doesn't carry its own uniform sets of standards for personal conduct. This would be a misunderstanding of what religion is and how religion actually operates. So the first major thing to understand is that religions are expressed through communities and individuals practicing that religion, and those practices change over time. Those practices are rooted in our actual praxis, our implementation or our understanding of religious beliefs. These set of standards that we like to call upon as being somehow immutable and eternal are really not the case. So the way someone practices Catholicism or practices Hinduism today is going to be bound up in the modern context. It is not going to be ancient, eternal, and immutable. It's not the same way someone practiced Catholicism or Hinduism centuries ago or millennia ago. So that would be one major thing to focus on. We don't look at just holy texts. We look at how those holy texts are interpreted. So even if you look in the case of Islam, where we have in the University of Birmingham, I think, has fragments of Qur'ans that go back centuries, and the wording is pretty much exactly the same as the exact wording of modern day Qur'ans. But the text is not important when it comes to understanding the influence of religious beliefs on culture and people. What's important is how those people interpret the text. So even if the religious texts remain the same, our understanding, collective and individual understanding of what those religious texts means and how they should be implemented, that constantly evolves and changes. Secondly, when we talk about group understandings or group interpretations, they vary hugely from group to group. So if we take Islam, for example, and we say, well, Indonesia is a Muslim country and Morocco is a Muslim country as well. So therefore, Islam and Islamic religious beliefs influence both Indonesian Muslims and Moroccan Muslims. This is a highly questionable statement. The type of lived Islam or practiced Islam in Morocco is significantly different the type of lived Islam or practiced Islam in Indonesia. The fact that these are both Muslim countries doesn't say much about how Moroccans or Indonesians actually understand and interpret those religious texts. And we can see there are major differences in the lived Islam of Morocco and Indonesia. And this then goes on to looking at Dr. Linda's last sentence here, asking us to consider how these cultures limit the choices people have in choosing a profession, a spouse, women's roles, and the garments they wear and behave. Firstly, the sentence is phrased in a very questionable manner. So it's asking us to consider how cultures limit choices. Now, in practice, you may have cultures that do limit practical choices, but this isn't because of some kind of inherent limitation. It's because cultures and religious beliefs change how we perceive things. They change how we conceive of certain issues. They change how we think about things. So it's a reductionist view to say, well, certain cultures limit certain choices. That misses how cultures actually interact with people's behavior, how they affect people's behavior. There's no hard limitation. No one's going to instantly burst into flames. It's a change of thinking, of conception, and of attitudes more than anything else. And secondly, religions, especially major global religious traditions, are hugely varied, so they exist in a symbiotic relationship with individual communities rather than having some kind of uniform monolithic existence. So if we look at how let's say if we take Dr. Linda's challenge here and actually consider this, if you consider our example of Indonesia and Morocco, the influence of Islam and religious culture in influencing, or in her words, limiting the choices of an Indonesian's choice of profession, choice of spouse or women's roles is not going to be the same as a Moroccan's influenced by religion and religious culture. There's going to be major differences. And we can see this in the role of Indonesian women in society. If you talk about women's roles, is very different to the role of Moroccan women in Moroccan society. If you look at the range of courtship rituals, very different courtship rituals and methods for selecting a partner in Indonesia than compared to Morocco, and garments are very different as well. So if you want to go to the veil and the scarf, very different rates of prevalence of scarf wearing or veiling amongst Moroccan and Indonesian women, but also even the type of scarf, the way it's worn, the way it's used is very different as well. So what we do if we follow this kind of attitude of, well, culture and religion are intertwined, religion says thing A, so therefore everyone who is part of that religion also will think thing A, is that it just doesn't actually seem to be true. If you look at the world as it is, there's a very complex interaction between culture, religion, institutions, groups, and people. But this kinds of, if thing A is true, then thing B is true, really fails on every level to explain how culture actually influences us.